Regrettably, I'm about to cause trouble. Written and narrated by Amie McNee. Chapter 22. I have always loved Christmas. Always. Even with all my brothers descending on Sherburn like the plague, even with all the pomp and show, especially with all the pomp and show. I loved the feeling of Christmas. I liked the dissolving divide between our world and the next. Something magical crept into our human realm. It didn't even feel like heaven was falling to earth. It felt like the fairy realm was creeping in sideways. Our homes taken over by the forest, with all the evergreen leaves entangled into the beams and all the extra candles littering the corridors. Ghost stories on everyone's tongues, and a frivolity that reminded me of tales about the Fae. Our clothes suddenly and permissibly broke every sumptuary law ever passed. Everyone in deep reds and purples, all trimmed with fur, and all glittering with jewels. I wore a deep crimson dress for our first night in court. My hair was out, which was unusual. I would stand out. I wanted to stand out, I think. I was waiting by the door, ready to leave. The witches fussed with their trinkets and witchy things. Rufus had retied his turban. "What will you do, Rufus?" I asked gently. He had not been in the mood to talk. "I'm just going to present myself to His Majesty and see what happens." "I'll run away with you if you need," I reminded him. He glanced down at me. "There is no running away from the king." Shivers erupted up my arms. Had we led Rufus to danger? "Are you not safe?" I asked. He didn't reply. My nerves intensified. "How do we get into the next court?" I asked, as each entrance was heavily guarded. "I believe someone will collect us," Zita said. Sure enough, the words had only just left her lips and there was a knock at the door. A stern guard nodded his head in greeting. "I don't know nothing about the moor," he said, surprised by Rufus's presence. "I'm the new trumpeter," Rufus grunted. He looked at him suspiciously. "I'll have to ask about that." We followed him out into the base court. The red stone of the palace glowed a golden colour in the dying light. We reached Queen Anne's gates. I wondered what she might look like. I had heard she was beautiful and that she was with child. I prayed that the baby boy would be born male. The gates were guarded by 6 armed men. "These women here are the 3 witches for the 12 days, our guide explained. "They are to be let forwards. This," he gestured rudely towards Rufus, "says he's the new trumpeter." "He's not the new trumpeter, he's the old trumpeter. Where have you been?" asked one of the guards. "I got married," Rufus said shortly. "The king will want to see me." He spoke with such authority, the guards hardly shrugged. They just waved us all through. It was busy in the clock tower court too, but less busy, I noticed. I tried not to wear the smugness on my face, but I couldn't help it. I had been brought up to enjoy social ascension. This is what my parents had raised me for, getting through the gates to higher and higher courts. The thoughts of my parents flipped my tummy over. I wasn't sure whether in excitement or fear. I think I was excited. I think I wanted them to see me. I wanted them to be confused. I wanted them to panic, embarrass themselves. And then I wanted them to realize I hadn't needed them anyway. I got to court on my own. Rufus grabbed my shoulder and moved me out the way of someone presumably important. Everyone seemed to tower over me. Perhaps being important made you several inches taller. We were walking to the far left corner of the courtyard, where there was a fire in a big pit with people gathered around it. "Are we to stay outside the whole evening? Does one tell ghost stories outside?" I asked, concerned. Our wind was picking up, and it was bitter. "I should hope not, but we must put ourselves in the right position to get our entry," said Zita, manoeuvring me to face the next gateway. I assumed it led inside the palace itself. "Otherwise, yes, we'll have to set up our stalls here, near the fire." Hildy sidled up close to me. Whether to get warm or to be kind, I couldn't tell. "Behind you is the King's Gallery," she whispered excitedly. "And opposite, that's the Queen's." "Have you seen anyone important yet?" I signed, bashing my chest and doing a pompous walk to signal important. She looked around. "Ah, we are about to," she whispered, pointing to the gate. There were people exiting a door on the side of the Queen's presence chambers. Was I more nervous to see my mother or the Queen? I didn't recognize anyone immediately, but the crowds knew what to do. Everyone started pushing towards the ladies in waiting. I instinctively began to move with them, but there was a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. Zita was shaking her head. Then she gestured behind us. I looked to the opposite end of the courtyard. There was movement in the King's Gallery. I want to be in the king's good graces, not her majesty's, she whispered into my ear. Why? I asked. She is not in favour. She muttered it so low, I only just heard her. The door opened to the king's gallery. Zita moved me to face the door. We were too close. We were not important enough. We needed to move away. Even in the bitter wind, I began to sweat. Rufus tried to move back. Zita stopped him with a single finger. Stay, she signed. Rufus looked down at the witch, tight-lipped, annoyed. A small corridor, made entirely out of sticky-beaking, flattering courtiers, was made, and the witches, Rufus and I, were right up the front. Men began moving between the flatterers, and I tried to follow the lead of everyone around me, but no one had fallen into a full bow just yet. Is he the king? No. Is he my father? No. That looks like my brother. Nay. Is he the king? Is he the king? No, no, no. Oh. Oh, yes. I fell instinctively to the floor. Of course, he was obvious. It was obvious. King Henry Tudor. He was everything you'd think a king might be, in full regalia. I had only caught a glimpse of his face, but it had been handsome, young almost. His beard was not entirely full, and a friendly orange colour. I snuck a glance up. His Majesty was taking his time, speaking to people in his human corridor. Rufus was crouched behind me, trying to hide, I presume. And if it hadn't been such a serious situation, I would have laughed, big black fairy cowering behind the tiny white with fright witch. He moved towards us. I lowered my head even further. Oh Christ, I was going to have to address him. Good God. It was his voice. The king's. Reasonable black man. I couldn't make out his tone. Was he angry? He sounded more shocked. Is it you? I snuck another glance. Rufus was standing. Your Majesty. Rufus's voice sounded so different, so English. I'm here to ask your forgiveness. There was silence. Christ. The performance scheduled for the third night of Yuletide was going to be changed to be a public execution of a fairy. How horrifically unfestive. But then I heard a low, deep chuckle. You fucking cheeky trumpeter! The king's laughter cut through the cold air. The crowd perceptibly relaxed. Some people even laughed, echoing the king despite not having any idea of what was going on. I've missed you, my brother. Brother? I looked up. The two were embracing. The king had a tight grip of Rufus, his hands indenting Rufus's tunic with the effort of his hug. I've missed you too, Henry. I looked sideways to Hildy, and she looked at me, grinning. What the fuck? I mouthed and signed. I couldn't believe it. Rufus. Our Rufus, just Christian named the king. You are back to play for me. You will play for me, Reasonable. It would be an honour. He pulled Rufus into the corridor of flatterers and indicated he should walk with him. What happened? The king asked, arm still around Rufus. I shook my head as I rose, the king now far enough past that I could stand fully erect. She didn't want a blackamoor as a husband, Henry. That bitch, I heard him say, now obviously angry. I tell you, Reasonable, women are betrayers. We shouldn't call us men and women. We should call us men and Judases. All Judases. How came you here? Henry had stopped to let someone kiss his ring. Why didn't you come straight back to me? I worried you would be disappointed, Your Majesty, having put so much effort into our match, and so generously paid for the wedding. Nonsense, he scoffed. I, of all people, know what devils these women can be. I told her that to keep her virtue, I would play dead. She is widowed by law. I didn't want to haunt your courts as a ghost. You should have divorced her, Rufus. Divorced her and come straight back home. Where have you been staying? Rufus glanced back to us. I have been taken care of by 3 witches. Rufus smiled at me, and my heart jumped. They gave me a home and food when I was down on my luck. And as God would have it, they are your preferred wise women at Yuletide. They are here? Henry asked, looking back at us. They are. Ah, he made to turn back. I remember the Yuletide witches. I dropped back down to the floor. The astrologer, he said, letting Zita kiss his hand. And the healer. My wife will want to hear from you, wise women. She is experiencing pains in this pregnancy. Hildy rose. It would be an honour to tend to her, Your Majesty. He grunted. I was staying low. You've taken care of my trumpeter after he was abandoned by the devil's spawn. We have loved him like he was one of our own. Henry nodded, approving. I will have you in my quarters. You will read the stars for my friends, won't you, witch? Said the King of fucking England. My mind was reeling. Of course, Your Majesty. And Reasonable says there is a third wise woman. He looked around, and I made myself raise my head. Your Majesty, I said, before Zita could introduce me. Time to shine, Maude. He paused, looking at my face. He looked at every part of me, examining my cheekbones, my hair, my bust, my dress. I allowed him to appraise me. What is it you do, wise woman? Maude. Wise woman Maude, Your Majesty. I am a charmer, and I read people. This caught his attention. You can read my thoughts? Your feelings, Your Majesty. And what do I feel? Jesus Christ, talk about a tricky first day on the job. Prove yourself, Maude. I looked at him. I appraised his face as he had just appraised mine. He liked it. He liked it a lot. I could feel his body responding to my gaze. Do you need to touch me to connect with my heart? He asked. You should touch my face or something. What a randy man. If I can touch your beard, Your Majesty, I might feel better acquainted with your heart. Maude, God save you, whispered Zita. I ignored her. The king just smiled. My beard is all yours. I moved forward and let my fingers touch His Majesty's beard. It was soft, and I twisted my fingers around it. I could smell his breath. It smelt like wine. I looked into his eyes. He was aroused by me, no doubt about it. But when I really looked into his eyes, only a few inches from him, I saw a deep sadness. You are tired, I whispered. You need something new. Something new, he whispered back. What? I looked at him. He wanted a new woman. He wanted a new marriage. That's why Zita had said that thing about the Queen. I could see it in his eyes. Desire for anything but his wife. Even when she was with child. What new? He asked again. I wasn't about to tell him to go get a new queen, another divorce. I reached out for some words, hoping the heavens would find me some. You need to freshen your life. New faces, new foods. You need Rufus's music, I whispered. Who is Rufus? He asked. Forgive me, you need Reasonable's music. He looked back at the fairy. I like your new family more than I liked your wife, he told him. Maude, you will take your family into my gallery. They will practice their spells and tell their ghost stories with me tonight.